Deep within the archives of medieval history lies a truth that historians have long struggled to convey fully. The sieges of the Middle Ages were not the romantic tableau of knights and banners that populate our imagination. They were slow, grinding nightmares that transformed both besiegers and besieged into something less than human. When we speak of medieval warfare, we often conjure images of charging cavalry and clashing swords on open battlefields. But the reality is far different and far darker. From the 11th century onward, the siege became the dominant form of military conflict in Europe, outnumbering pitched battles by a significant margin. This shift occurred because of one simple reason: castles worked. These fortifications, rising like stone mountains across the European landscape, represented more than military installations. They were centres of power, administration, and wealth. To control a region, you needed to control its castles. But taking a castle required something that no army wanted to commit to. Time. Months, sometimes years, would pass as armies camped outside stone walls, slowly exhausting every resource, every strategy, every shred of humanity they possessed. The siege was a peculiar form of warfare that combined engineering brilliance with methodical cruelty. It was a test of endurance where starvation often proved more effective than any weapon. It was a psychological crucible that broke men's spirits before their bodies gave out. What we're about to explore isn't comfortable history. It's the kind of narrative that reveals what humans are capable of when survival is measured in weeks rather than moments. When the distinction between victor and victim blurs into something unrecognizable. The medieval siege was perhaps the purest distillation of war's capacity to transform human beings into instruments of suffering and survival, stripped of the glory that battle songs might celebrate. In the pages of chroniclers from the period, written in careful Latin script by monks and scribes, we find accounts that disturb even across the centuries that separate us from these events. They wrote of things that made them pause, that forced them to question what they were recording. Let us begin with a landscape. Picture, if you will, the approach to a besieged castle in the early 13th century. The surrounding countryside has been deliberately burned, fields reduced to ash so that the defenders cannot be secretly supplied with food. The earth is churned by thousands of feet and hooves, transformed into a muddy wasteland where nothing grows. The air itself carries the weight of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something worse. The sweet, cloying stench of death that hangs over every siege camp like an invisible fog. Closer to the castle walls, the ground becomes a killing field. Bodies lie where they fell during the previous day's assault, some partially stripped of armour by scavengers brave or desperate enough to risk the archers on the battlements. The castle itself rises before us, its walls impossibly thick, its towers reaching toward a sky that seems indifferent to the suffering below. From this distance, you might hear the creak of siege engines being loaded, the shouted commands of engineers, the occasional scream of a man hit by a defender's crossbow bolt. But there's something else too, something that the chroniclers struggled to capture in words. It's the sound of waiting, the tension of thousands of men knowing that today might be their last or worse, that today will be exactly like yesterday, and tomorrow will be the same again, stretching forward into a future that promises only more suffering before any resolution arrives. This was the reality of medieval siege warfare, not glorious, not quick, just methodical, patient, and absolutely merciless. The siege was warfare stripped down to its most fundamental truth. One group of people trying to outlast another with every resource, every innovation, every dark impulse of human nature brought to bear on the problem of making the other side surrender. In the medieval period, particularly from the 12th through the 15th centuries, this form of conflict dominated military thinking. Commanders understood that controlling territory meant controlling fortifications. A pitched battle might win you glory and a place in the songs, but a successful siege won you actual power. The numbers tell part of the story. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, sieges outnumbered major battles by a significant margin. The same pattern held true during the Crusades, the various civil wars that tore through England, and the countless regional conflicts that defined medieval politics. Warfare had become, in essence, the art of taking and holding fortified positions. But why? The answer lies in understanding what a castle represented in medieval society. These weren't just military installations. They were the physical manifestation of feudal power. A lord's castle was his seat of authority, the place from which he administered justice, collected taxes, and projected his power over the surrounding lands. Towns grew up in the shadow of castle walls, their economies tied to the fortress and its garrison. More practically, castles controlled strategic locations. They commanded river crossings, mountain passes, and major roads. An army that marched past a hostile castle did so at its peril, knowing that its supply lines could be cut, its rear harassed by sorties from the garrison. To wage war effectively, you had to neutralize these fortifications, and neutralizing them meant siege. The development of castle architecture represents one of the great arms races of the Middle Ages. Each innovation in offensive siege technology prompted defensive countermeasures, which in turn led to new offensive techniques. It was a deadly dance that drove both military and architectural evolution for centuries. The earliest Norman castles in England, built following William the Conqueror's invasion in 1066, were relatively simple affairs. The modern Bailey design placed a wooden tower atop a natural or artificial mound, with a courtyard at its base surrounded by a palisade. These could be constructed quickly and garrisoned with relatively small forces, but they had obvious weaknesses. Fire was their greatest enemy, and a determined assault could overwhelm their defences with enough men and time. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, these wooden structures began giving way to stone. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, driven by the increasing sophistication of siege techniques. A stone keep, properly provisioned and defended, could withstand assaults that would reduce wooden fortifications to ash in hours. The great stone castles that rose across Europe during this period were engineering marvels. Their walls weren't just thick, they were typically 20 feet or more of solid stone, often with rubble fill between inner and outer faces. These walls could absorb the impact of stone projectiles that would shatter lesser structures. At regular intervals, towers projected from the walls, allowing defenders to fire along the wall's length and eliminate blind spots where attackers might shelter. Initially, these towers were square, but architects soon discovered that round towers were superior. They eliminated corners that sappers could attack, provided better structural stability, and reduced blind spots even further. The bases of walls and towers were often given a sloping protective layer of stone called a talus, designed to make climbing difficult and cause objects dropped from above to bounce unpredictably into attacking forces. Around the late 12th century, the concept of concentric fortification emerged, particularly after knights returning from the Crusades brought back ideas they'd observed in Byzantine and Islamic castle design. These castles had multiple rings of walls, each higher than the last, creating layers of defence that made assault progressively more difficult. Edward the Third's castles in Wales, built in the late 13th century, represent perhaps the pinnacle of this design philosophy, with their multiple baileys, elaborate gatehouses, and integration of natural defensive features. But all these architectural innovations had a single purpose: to make the castle so difficult to assault that attackers would be forced into the grinding attrition of a siege, and sieges, as defenders well knew, favoured those inside the walls, provided they had prepared properly. Preparation for a potential siege was an ongoing concern for any castellan worth his position. Food stores were the obvious priority. Granaries needed to be kept stocked with grain, which could last for years if properly stored and kept dry. Salted meat, dried fish, and preserved vegetables filled storerooms carved into the castle's lower levels were cool. Temperatures helped preserve them. Wine and ale were stored in vast quantities, not just for morale but as crucial sources of hydration if the water supply was compromised. Speaking of water, most castles had wells dug to tremendous depths, ensuring access to groundwater that couldn't be easily poisoned by besiegers. Some castles also had systems to collect and store rainwater in cisterns. The importance of water cannot be overstated. More than one siege ended when the defenders' water supply failed or was contaminated. But provisioning went beyond food and water. Defenders needed materials for repairs, as siege engines would inevitably damage walls and towers. Stockpiles of stone, timber, iron, and other construction materials had to be maintained. Weapons and ammunition for the garrison's own projectile weapons needed to be abundant. Arrows, crossbow bolts, stones for throwing or slinging. Specialised equipment for dealing with various siege threats had to be ready. Pots of oil or water that could be heated and poured on attackers, materials for making and extinguishing fires, tools for repairs and countermining operations. The garrison itself required careful management. Too small, and you couldn't adequately defend all sections of the walls. Too large, and you'd exhaust your provisions too quickly. The ideal garrison size depended on the castle's extent, but could range from a few dozen men for a small fortress to well over 1,000 for major strongholds. Then there was the question of non-combatants. When a siege threatened, the surrounding population would often flee to the castle for protection, bringing whatever portable wealth and food they could carry. This presented a terrible dilemma for defenders. Each additional mouth meant provisions would be exhausted more quickly, but turning away your own people was both morally troubling and politically dangerous. Some commanders made the cold calculation to refuse entry to civilians. Others admitted them, then later expelled them when supplies grew scarce, leaving desperate refugees trapped between the castle walls and the besieging army's lines. These people, caught in what medieval sources called no man's land, often suffered the worst fate of anyone involved in the siege, slowly starving to death when neither side would help them. The psychological preparation was perhaps most crucial of all. Defenders needed to accept that they might be sealed inside these walls for months or even years. They needed to believe in their cause strongly enough to endure that confinement, that grinding daily routine of watch duty and rationing and waiting. Chronicles from the period make clear that morale was often the decisive factor in a siege's outcome. A garrison that believed relief was coming, that their suffering had purpose, could endure conditions that would seem unbearable. But once hope began to fade, once men started to doubt that anyone was coming to save them, collapse could be swift. The architecture of desperation, then, wasn't just the physical structure of stone and mortar. It was the carefully constructed web of preparations, both material and mental, that defenders built to survive the ordeal ahead. And make no mistake, it was an ordeal that would test every aspect of their humanity. When an army arrived to lay siege to a castle, they brought with them an arsenal that represented centuries of accumulated military knowledge. These were not primitive weapons. They were sophisticated engineering solutions to the problem of breaching stone fortifications, and their deployment required skilled craftsmen, significant resources, and careful planning. The most iconic of all siege weapons was the trebuchet. This was not the crude catapult of popular imagination. The trebuchet was a precision instrument, a massive wooden framework that could stand 50 feet tall or more, capable of hurling stones weighing several hundred pounds across distances exceeding 900 feet. The key to the trebuchet's power lay in its counterweight mechanism. Unlike earlier traction trebuchets that relied on teams of men pulling on ropes, the counterweight trebuchet used a massive weight, sometimes several tons of stone or lead, dropping through a carefully calculated arc to fling the projectile from the throwing arm. Construction of a trebuchet was a major undertaking. Master carpenters and engineers would design the frame, selecting massive timbers that could withstand the tremendous forces involved. The throwing arm had to be precisely balanced, the sling carefully crafted to release its projectile at the optimal moment. When Edward I of England besieged Stirling Castle in 1304, he ordered the construction of a trebuchet so large it required 5 master carpenters and 50 labourers 3 months to build. This monster, which Edward named Warwolf, was apparently so impressive that when the Scottish defenders tried to surrender, Edward refused to accept until he'd had a chance to see his new weapon in action. The psychological impact of these engines cannot be overstated. The sound they made, the creak of timber under strain, the whoosh of the arms swinging, the deep thud of the counterweight hitting its stop, followed by the shriek of a massive stone hurtling through the air, announced to everyone within hearing that serious violence was about to commence. Defenders watching from the walls would see the arm rise, have a moment to try to judge where the projectile would hit, then experience the teeth-rattling crash as hundreds of pounds of stone struck their fortifications. But stones weren't the only ammunition. Chronicles and archaeological evidence reveal that trebuchets launched a horrifying variety of projectiles. Dead horses or other animals might be flung over the walls to spread disease. Human corpses, particularly those of defenders killed in earlier fighting, were sometimes used to further demoralise the garrison. Containers of burning pitch or other incendiaries could start fires inside the castle. There are even accounts of pots filled with quicklime or other caustic substances being launched to burst on impact and blind defenders. In one particularly grim instance recorded during a 15th century siege, attackers used their trebuchet to return the severed heads of captured defenders to their comrades inside the walls. The message was clear. There would be no mercy, no quarter, no relief from the psychological pressure being applied. Ballistae represented the other major class of artillery. These were essentially giant crossbows, mounted on sturdy frames, capable of launching heavy bolts or smaller stones with tremendous velocity and accuracy. While they lacked the trebuchet's ability to hurl massive stones, ballistae could target specific weak points in a castle's defences or pick off defenders on the walls with terrifying precision. A well-aimed ballista bolt could punch through multiple people if they were unfortunate enough to be standing in line. It could penetrate wooden shields and even some types of armour at closer ranges. The psychological effect of watching a fellow defender suddenly sprouting a 3-foot bolt from his torso, driven with such force that it pinned him to the wall behind, cannot be calculated but was undoubtedly significant. Battering rams represented a more direct approach to breaching defences. These were exactly what they sound like: massive logs, sometimes with ironclad heads shaped like rams, suspended from a frame and swung repeatedly against gates or wall sections. The simplest rams were just carried by a group of men and smashed against the target, but more sophisticated designs housed the ram in a movable shed called a cat or penthouse, protecting the operators from projectiles dropped by defenders above. The effectiveness of a battering ram depended on finding a vulnerable point in the defences and having the time and protection to work on it repeatedly. A well-designed gate might have multiple layers of reinforcement, and walls were generally too thick to breach this way. But the psychological impact of the rhythmic thunder of a ram striking your defences, hour after hour, day after day, was its own form of warfare. Siege towers represented perhaps the most ambitious siege weapon. These were mobile wooden towers, often as tall as the castle walls they were meant to assault, built on wheels or rollers so they could be pushed up to the fortifications. The top level of a siege tower contained a drawbridge that could be dropped onto the battlements, allowing attackers to storm across rather than having to scale ladders under fire. Building a siege tower was an enormous undertaking. The structure had to be tall enough to reach the walls, stable enough not to tip when loaded with soldiers, and strong enough to withstand whatever the defenders threw at it. Medieval illustrations show designs that resemble small fortresses on wheels with multiple levels connected by ladders, walls protecting the soldiers inside, and sometimes even a roof to defend against projectiles dropped from above. Fire was the greatest threat to these wooden behemoths. Defenders would pour oil or pitch down onto approaching towers and set them ablaze. To counter this, attackers covered the towers with wet hides or other fire-resistant materials. Some chronicles mention the hides being soaked in vinegar, though historians debate whether this was actually effective or just a belief of the time. There are accounts of towers being soaked with urine before approaching the walls, the ammonia supposedly providing some fire resistance. One can only imagine the smell as these massive structures rolled toward their targets, dripping with whatever liquids the besiegers thought might help them survive long enough to be useful. The introduction of incendiary weapons added another horrifying dimension to siege warfare. Greek fire, the most famous of these, was a closely guarded Byzantine secret, a liquid mixture that ignited on contact with air and couldn't be extinguished with water. The Byzantines primarily used it in naval warfare, but there are accounts of it being employed in land sieges as well. The exact composition remains unknown to this day, though modern historians speculate it involved petroleum products, perhaps mixed with quicklime or other chemicals. What we know from contemporary accounts is that it was absolutely terrifying. The liquid would stick to whatever it touched — wood, cloth, flesh — and burn with an intensity that water couldn't quench. Some sources suggest that vinegar or sand might extinguish it, but in the chaos of battle such remedies were rarely available when needed. More commonly used were various forms of heated or burning oil, tar and pitch. These substances could be poured from the walls onto attackers below, or loaded into pots and launched by catapults. The oil didn't need to be boiling to be effective. Even heated oil could cause severe burns, and was difficult to remove once it adhered to clothing or skin. Then there were the more creative applications of fire. Defenders might launch flaming arrows or bolts to set fire to wooden siege equipment. Attackers might fling containers of burning material over the walls to start fires inside the castle. In later centuries, incendiary weapons became even more sophisticated, with recipes for various mixtures that burned hotter or longer, or created dense smoke to choke defenders. The arrival of gunpowder in Europe during the 14th century marked the beginning of the end for traditional siege warfare, though the transition took longer than one might think. Early cannons, called bombards, were dangerous to their operators as much as to their targets. They were more likely to explode than to function properly, and their manufacture required knowledge that was initially rare and expensive. But by the 15th century, artillery had become more reliable and more effective. The advantage of cannons was their ability to concentrate tremendous force on a small section of wall. Where trebuchets scattered their impact across the wall's surface, a cannonball would strike the same spot repeatedly, eventually creating a breach. The psychological impact was also significant. The thunder of cannon fire and the smoke it produced added to the siege's atmosphere of technological terror. During the siege of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans employed massive bombards that could fire stone balls weighing up to 1,300 pounds. These guns required hundreds of oxen to move and had to be constructed on site, but they ultimately succeeded in breaching the city's famous Theodosian walls, which had stood for over 1,000 years. It's worth noting that all these weapons required substantial logistical support. Siege engines needed constant maintenance and repair. Ammunition had to be stockpiled or manufactured on site. Skilled engineers and craftsmen were essential, and their services commanded high prices. A single siege could bankrupt a lord or even a king if it dragged on too long. The weapons of siege warfare, then, were as much economic instruments as military ones. They represented a commitment of resources that couldn't easily be withdrawn once made. They declared to everyone watching that this siege would continue until something broke — the walls, the defender's will, or the attacker's coffers. And in that contest of endurance, victory went to whoever could sustain the suffering longer. Of all the techniques employed in medieval siege warfare, perhaps none was more insidious, more dangerous, or more effective than undermining. This was warfare conducted not in the light of day, but in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth, where men dug their way toward enemy fortifications with nothing but picks, shovels, and an intimate knowledge of how to collapse structures from below. Mining, or undermining as it was more properly called, exploited a fundamental weakness in even the most impressive fortifications. Stone walls, for all their strength, rested on foundations. Undermine those foundations and the entire structure above would come crashing down. The technique was ancient. Records show it being used in sieges dating back to the Romans and beyond, but medieval engineers refined it into a dark art. The process began with selecting a section of wall to target. Corner towers were particularly vulnerable, as were sections of the wall that projected outward. The miners would then begin their tunnel at a safe distance from the castle, usually under cover of some protective structure, and dig toward the foundation of the chosen wall section. This was back-breaking, dangerous work conducted in conditions that would horrify modern observers. The tunnels were barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, lit only by dim lanterns or candles that consumed the already scarce oxygen. The miners worked in shifts, chipping away at earth and rock, hauling the debris back down the tunnel to be disposed of where it wouldn't alert the defenders. They had to judge their direction and depth by feel and experience, with no way to see where they were going once underground. As the tunnel progressed under the wall's foundation, the miners would hollow out a chamber and shore it up with wooden timbers. This was the critical stage. The chamber had to be large enough to cause a significant collapse when it fell, but the support timbers had to hold long enough for the miners to finish their work and get clear. When everything was ready, the chamber would be packed with combustible materials. In early sieges, this might be simple brush and kindling. Later, when the technique became more sophisticated, specialised materials were used. The most famous example involves King John of England's siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. This siege demonstrates the technique at its most effective and its most bizarre. Rochester Castle was one of the most formidable fortifications in England. Its massive stone keep stood over 100 feet tall, with walls 12 feet thick at the base. When John laid siege to it in October 1215, he brought every weapon at his disposal. Siege engines pounded the walls for weeks with little effect. The outer bailey eventually fell, but the defenders retreated to the keep and continued their resistance. John then ordered his miners to begin work. They dug under the southeast corner of the keep, a difficult and dangerous operation that took weeks. The defenders knew mining was underway. They could probably hear the digging if they listened carefully from inside the keep, but countermining in such a massive structure was nearly impossible. When the tunnel chamber under the tower was ready, John sent a letter to his justiciar that has become famous in the annals of siege warfare. "Send to us," he wrote, "with all speed by day and night, 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating, to bring fire beneath the tower." Those 40 pigs weren't meant for a feast. They were needed for their fat. The unfortunate animals were slaughtered, and their rendered fat was used to fuel an intense fire in the mine chamber. When the wooden supports burned through, the tunnel collapsed, and with it, a huge section of the keep's corner tower came crashing down into the courtyard. The defenders, remarkably, still didn't surrender. The keep at Rochester was divided by a massive cross wall, and they retreated behind this to the remaining portion. Only when their food ran out entirely, and they were reduced to eating their horses, did the garrison finally surrender on November 30th, after almost 8 weeks of siege. The collapsed tower was later rebuilt, but in a round rather than square design, a clear acknowledgement that round towers were more resistant to undermining. This siege became the textbook, example of successful mining operations, and influenced castle design throughout England for decades afterward. The defenders weren't helpless against mining. They could employ a technique called countermining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers' mines. If successful, this would lead to brutal underground combat in the darkness, with men fighting in cramped spaces with daggers and short swords, neither side able to retreat easily. Chronicles record instances of these underground battles, and they sound like something from Nightmare. Men struggling in near-total darkness, the smoke from their lights choking them, the constant fear that the tunnel might collapse and bury them all. At least one chronicler describes combatants setting fires in the tunnels to smoke out their enemies, a tactic that must have been as dangerous to its users as to the intended victims. There were also defensive architectural measures that could be taken. Building the castle on solid bedrock made mining nearly impossible, though this wasn't always an option given other considerations in choosing a site. Surrounding the castle with a water-filled moat not only kept miners at a distance, but also created serious problems with groundwater flooding any tunnel they attempted. The moat at Kenilworth Castle was actually a massive artificial lake, and it proved decisive in the castle's ability to withstand the longest recorded siege in medieval English history. Some castle designs incorporated projecting buttresses and additional stone at the base of walls, creating a larger foundation that was harder to undermine. Round towers, as mentioned, were more resistant because they eliminated the vulnerable corners where mining efforts naturally concentrated. The removal of sharp angles in castle design, moving from square keeps and towers to polygonal or round structures, was a direct response to the threat of mining. During the siege of Dover Castle in 1216, French forces under Prince Louis attempted to undermine the castle's gate. The mine was successful. A tower collapsed as intended, but the English defenders had prepared a secondary defensive line behind the gate. When the French poured through the breach, created by the mine's collapse, they found themselves in a killing zone, and the assault was repulsed with heavy losses. This demonstrated that even successful mining didn't guarantee victory. Determined defenders could adapt to the loss of sections of their fortification. The technique of mining continued to evolve throughout the medieval period. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as gunpowder became more available, mines began to be packed with explosives rather than simply burned. This created much more dramatic collapses and made the technique even more effective. The terrifying uncertainty of mining added a psychological dimension to sieges that shouldn't be overlooked. Defenders would place bowls of water on the ground near walls and watch for ripples that might indicate digging beneath them. They'd press their ears to the stone, listening for the sounds of picks and shovels working in the darkness below. Every unexplained sound, every slight tremor, might herald the moment when the ground would open beneath them and their proud fortifications would collapse into rubble. For the miners themselves, the work was a special kind of hell. They laboured in darkness and danger, knowing that a mistake in their calculations or an unexpected encounter with harder rock might doom them. They breathed foul air thick with dust, worked in cramped positions that strained every muscle, and lived with the constant possibility that the tunnel would collapse and bury them alive. Many miners were recruited from communities with mining traditions, places where men were already accustomed to working underground in similar conditions. But even experienced miners found siege work uniquely stressful, knowing that their enemy was actively trying to kill them, that collapse might come not from accident, but from deliberate action by defenders above or in countermines beside them. The warfare underground represents one of the most claustrophobic personal forms of combat in the medieval siege. It stripped away the distance and abstraction of trebuchets hurling stones or archers firing from walls. Instead, it reduced war to its most primal form, men in the darkness, trying to collapse structures on each other, or meeting in hand-to-hand combat in spaces where neither could properly stand. There was nothing glorious about it. No song celebrated the miners who died buried in collapsed tunnels. But their work often decided the outcome of sieges that might otherwise have dragged on indefinitely. Understanding mining and countermining is essential to understanding the full horror of medieval siege warfare. This was war where the ground itself became unreliable, where the defenders' strongest asset, their stone walls, could be turned against them through patient, invisible work in the earth below. It was patient, methodical, and utterly merciless, and it was terrifyingly effective. When all the sophisticated weapons and tactics failed or proved too expensive to deploy, siege warfare reverted to its most fundamental strategy, starvation. This was warfare through patience rather than violence, victory through the slow exhaustion of the enemy's resources rather than dramatic assault. And it was in many ways the most terrible form of siege warfare because its effects were both inevitable and prolonged. The theory behind starvation sieges was simple. cut off all routes in and out of the castle or city, prevent any supplies from reaching the defenders, then wait. Eventually, no matter how well provisioned the fortress, no matter how determined its garrison, hunger and thirst would break them, all you needed was patience and the resources to maintain your siege long enough for nature to take its course. In practice, this was far more complicated than it sounds. A properly prepared castle might have provisions to last months or even years. Records from the period show that major fortifications often maintained stores that could support their garrison for a year or more under rationing. Some of the great Crusader castles in the Holy Land were provisioned even more extensively, with supplies intended to last through multiple siege seasons. The defenders' provisions followed a grim hierarchy. In the early stages of a siege, rationing would begin, but the garrison would still eat reasonably well. Bread, salted meat, dried fish, preserved vegetables, not luxurious perhaps, but adequate. As time wore on and stocks dwindled, the quality and quantity of food would decline. More severe rationing would be imposed. Food would be distributed based on importance to the defence, knights and soldiers first, then essential workers, then everyone else. This created obvious social tensions. Chronicles from long sieges frequently mention disputes over food, accusations of hoarding, and the breakdown of normal social hierarchies as hunger began to dominate every thought. As the siege continued and provisions continued to shrink, the defenders would begin consuming things that normally wouldn't be considered food. Horses were often among the first casualties. A horse consumed fodder that could be used for other purposes, and its meat could feed the garrison. Chronicles from various sieges mention the consumption of horses becoming routine after several months of blockade. They'd start with the older or wounded animals, those less valuable for any potential sortie, and work their way through the stables. Once the horses were gone, other animals followed. Dogs, cats, rats. Anything that could be caught and killed would end up in the pot. Leather from shoes, belts and shield coverings could be boiled to extract what little nutrition it contained. There are accounts of defenders chewing on leather simply to have something in their mouths, even when they knew it provided no real sustenance. But the deterioration didn't stop there. In the most desperate sieges, when all food sources had been exhausted, human flesh became an option. The evidence for cannibalism during medieval sieges comes from multiple sources and isn't something we can dismiss as propaganda or exaggeration. During the Great Famine of 1315-1317, which affected much of northern Europe, there were widespread reports of cannibalism among starving populations. The chronicler from Salzburg recorded that people devoured each other and that parents ate their children. While some historians debate the extent of these claims, the sheer number of independent accounts suggests that cannibalism did occur during this period of extreme scarcity. In siege situations where conditions were even more extreme and prolonged, the evidence is more direct. We'll explore the specific case of the First Crusade siege of Ma'ara in more detail later, but it's worth noting here that more than a dozen contemporary Christian sources describe Crusaders consuming the flesh of their Muslim enemies. Some accounts say this was due to starvation, others suggest it was psychological warfare, and the truth likely involved both factors. What's particularly haunting about starvation sieges is their inevitability. Both sides knew what was happening. The defenders could watch their stores diminish day by day, week by week. They could calculate with grim precision when they would run out of food entirely. The besiegers, camped outside, knew that time was on their side, provided their own supplies held out. This leads to one of the great ironies of starvation sieges. They often threatened both sides. The besieging army also needed to eat, and supplying thousands of men in the field for months on end was a massive logistical challenge. Supply lines could be cut by enemy relief forces. Disease could sweep through the siege camp, killing men faster than combat ever would. Bad weather could make maintaining the siege impossible. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 illustrates the limitations of starvation as a tactic. King Henry III laid siege to this formidable fortress on June 21st, determined to break the rebel garrison that had taken refuge there. Kenilworth was surrounded by extensive water defences, a massive artificial lake on two sides, pools and marshes on the others. This made assault nearly impossible and also meant mining was out of the question. Henry had no choice but to try to starve the defenders out. For the next 172 days, almost 6 months, the siege continued. Henry brought everything he could to bear: numerous trebuchets, siege towers, even barges transported from Chester for an attempted amphibious assault across the lake. Nothing worked. The defenders, well supplied and with fish from the lake to supplement their stores, held out with remarkable determination. The chronicler at the time remarked that it was the longest siege in English history, and noted that it achieved little beyond costing Henry an enormous amount of money. In the end, the defenders surrendered not because they were starving, they reportedly still had provisions, but because a negotiated settlement offered terms they could accept. The dictum of Kenilworth allowed the rebels to buy back their lands and leave with their weapons. Disease and general exhaustion had finally worn down their will to resist, but the starvation tactic itself had largely failed. This case demonstrates that defenders with adequate water and decent provisions could outlast even the most determined siege, provided their morale held. But morale was always the wild card. Hunger affects the mind as much as the body. As men grew weaker, as they watched their comrades deteriorate, as the gnawing emptiness in their bellies became the only thing they could think about, the psychological pressure became unbearable. Disputes over food could tear a garrison apart. In several recorded sieges, the garrison eventually surrendered not because they were completely out of food, but because they could no longer maintain discipline and unity in the face of prolonged hunger. There are accounts of garrison commanders being murdered by their own men when food distribution was perceived as unfair. In at least one case, the garrison's leaders ate better than the common soldiers, and when this became known, it sparked a mutiny that led to the castle's surrender. The question of non-combatants added another layer of horror to starvation sieges. When a castle or city was besieged, the surrounding population would often flee there for protection. But each additional mouth meant food would run out faster. Medieval commanders faced an impossible choice: refuse entry to their own people, potentially turning them against you and definitely harming your reputation, or accept them and hasten the exhaustion of your supplies. Some commanders chose a middle path that was perhaps the most cruel of all. They would admit the refugees initially, then later, when supplies were running low, expel them from the castle. This left these unfortunate people caught between the castle walls and the besieging army's lines. The besiegers might let them through initially, seeing it as a sign that the castle was weakening. But sometimes they would refuse to let the refugees through their lines, forcing them to remain in no man's land. The siege of Château Gaillard in 1203-1204 provides a particularly grim example of this practice. The castle's commander, Roger de Lacy, had admitted some 2,000 refugees from the surrounding area. As the siege stretched on, he made the difficult decision to expel them. At first, the French besiegers under King Philip III let them through their lines. But after a while, Philip stopped allowing them passage, apparently hoping that the burden of feeding them would force Roger to use up his supplies faster if he let them back in. The result was several hundred people trapped in the space between the two armies. They remained there for months, slowly starving to death as siege engines and arrows were exchanged over their heads. Finally, Philip took pity on them and gave them food, allowing them to disperse. But the fact that this situation arose at all, that commanders on both sides were willing to use these desperate civilians as pawns in their siege strategy, speaks volumes about the moral compromises that siege warfare demanded. Starvation as a weapon was preferred by medieval commanders in some sense because it avoided the massive casualties of a direct assault. If you could simply wait out the defenders, you preserved your own troops and might even take the castle relatively intact. But this preference had nothing to do with mercy. It was cold calculation. Lives and money weighed against time and patience. For the defenders, Starvation was perhaps the worst way to lose a siege because it stripped away any illusion of control. You couldn't fight hunger, you couldn't bargain with it. You could only endure it for as long as humanly possible, and then beyond that, until finally something broke, your body, your mind, or your will to continue. The slow death that starvation represented was medieval siege warfare at its most pitiless. It required no particular skill, no brilliant tactics, no sophisticated weapons, just patience and the willingness to watch other human beings waste away behind walls, knowing that eventually they would have no choice but to surrender or die. And die they did, in numbers that sometimes exceeded what would have been lost in a direct assault, their bodies weakened by prolonged malnutrition, their spirits broken by the daily reality of watching their provisions dwindle to nothing while the enemy waited outside, implacable and patient as death itself. Disease was the invisible enemy that haunted every medieval siege, striking without warning and killing indiscriminately. In many sieges, more men died from disease than from violence, and the conditions that fostered these outbreaks affected both attackers and defenders. This was warfare where the battlefield's true enemy wasn't the opposing army, but the microscopic organisms that thrived in the appalling sanitary conditions siege warfare inevitably created. The fundamental problem was simple. You had thousands of people living in close proximity for extended periods, with limited access to clean water, inadequate sanitation, and no understanding of germ theory. Medieval people understood that disease could spread, but they didn't know how or why, which made preventing outbreaks largely a matter of luck and tradition, rather than effective medicine. For defenders trapped inside a castle, the problems began with crowding. A castle designed to hold a garrison of 100 might suddenly house 500 or more if the surrounding population sought refuge there. These people would be crammed into every available space: towers, halls, courtyards, cellars. Privacy and personal space became luxuries. The smell alone must have been overwhelming. Toilet facilities that might be adequate for a normal garrison couldn't handle the increased population. Many castles had guardrobes, essentially holes in the wall that dropped waste down the outside of the castle or into the moat below. With hundreds of people using these facilities, they quickly became overwhelmed. The moat, if there was one, would become a cesspit. Inside the castle, any available bucket or container might serve as a chamber pot to be emptied when possible. But during a siege, going outside the walls to dispose of waste was obviously not an option. Waste accumulated. You can imagine what this meant for the castle's interior. The floors, the courtyards, every available space gradually fouled by the normal bodily functions of hundreds of desperate people. Clean water became increasingly hard to maintain. Even if the castle had a good well, you can't have hundreds of people drawing water without risking contamination. The bucket or rope used to draw water would touch countless hands, many of them unwashed and potentially carrying disease. If the water source was a cistern collecting rainwater, the situation was even more precarious. Any contamination could spoil the entire supply. The besiegers sometimes attempted to deliberately poison wells or water supplies, throwing dead animals or other contaminating substances down wells if they could get close enough. But honestly, deliberate poisoning was often unnecessary. The natural contamination from poor hygiene and waste management was usually sufficient to spread disease. The defender's diet, as we've discussed, would deteriorate over time. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to disease. As they consumed increasingly inadequate food, their body's ability to fight off infection declined. This created a vicious cycle. Hunger weakened them, making them more vulnerable to disease, and disease made their bodies less able to extract what nutrition they could from the limited food available. Outside the walls, the besiegers faced similar problems, but often on an even larger scale. A siege camp might house 10,000 men or more, plus all their horses and other animals. These camps sprawled across the landscape with soldiers living in tents or crude shelters. Sanitation was barely better than inside the castle. With thousands of men relieving themselves with no proper facilities, the ground around the camp became thoroughly contaminated. Streams and water sources in the area would become fouled. The besiegers had more space than the defenders and could theoretically maintain better hygiene, but in practice medieval armies weren't known for their sanitary discipline. The close proximity of so many people, combined with poor nutrition in the field, limited medical knowledge, and contaminated water sources, created ideal conditions for disease outbreaks. Dysentery was perhaps the most common killer. This bacterial infection of the intestines caused severe diarrhea, vomiting, fever, and dehydration. In its most severe form, bloody diarrhea could lead to death from fluid loss within days. Dysentery spread rapidly through contaminated water and food, and once it took hold in a siege camp or castle, it was nearly unstoppable. King John of England died from dysentery at Newark Castle in 1216, demonstrating that not even royalty was safe. During the Siege of Acre in 1189-1191, dysentery killed thousands in both the Crusader camp and the city itself. Contemporary chroniclers described men wasting away, their bodies racked by constant diarrhea and vomiting until they finally died from exhaustion and dehydration. The Crusader camp became so disease-ridden that it was said the stench could be smelled from great distances. Even prominent leaders weren't spared. The disease spread through all ranks. Another major killer was typhus, spread by lice, which thrived in the crowded, unwashed conditions of medieval siege warfare. People living in close quarters, wearing the same clothes day after day, with no opportunity to properly wash or delouse themselves, were perfect hosts for lice populations. The lice would spread from person to person, and with them, the bacteria that caused typhus. Symptoms began with fever, headache, and rash, progressing to delirium and in many cases death. Bubonic plague, when it appeared, was even more devastating. Though the Great Black Death pandemic came later in the medieval period, plague outbreaks did occur during sieges, and their effects were catastrophic. The disease spread through flea bites from infected rats, and the crowded, garbage-strewn conditions of siege camps and overcrowded castles provided ideal environments for rat populations to thrive. Medieval people noticed the connection between rats and plague, but didn't understand the mechanism. They just knew that when rats started dying in large numbers, human deaths often followed. Respiratory infections like pneumonia and tuberculosis spread easily in crowded conditions. In the cold, damp environment of a castle in winter, with hundreds of people huddled together for warmth, breathing each other's air, these diseases could sweep through the population. The weakened state of defenders suffering from malnutrition made them particularly vulnerable. Fevers, coughs, and difficulty breathing would progress to death for many, especially the very young and old. The siege of Harfleur during Henry Thuwav's 1415 campaign in France demonstrates how disease could devastate an attacking force. As the siege dragged on through the summer into early autumn, dysentery broke out in the English camp. Thousands fell ill. Even Henry's brother, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, was so sick he had to be sent home to England. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry's army had been so reduced by disease that his subsequent campaign had to be significantly scaled back. The irony is that Harfleur fell partially because disease had also ravaged the defenders, but the English paid a terrible price for their victory. What made disease so terrifying in medieval siege warfare was its randomness and inevitability. You could train to fight, you could prepare fortifications, you could ration supplies. But you couldn't fight disease, not really. Medieval medicine had limited understanding of what caused disease and almost no effective treatments. Prayers, bleeding, and herbal remedies were about all physicians could offer, and these rarely helped. Religious explanations for disease, divine punishment for sin were common, which did nothing to prevent outbreaks. Some sensible sanitary practices were followed. Commanders tried to maintain some order in their camps, designating areas for waste disposal. Inside castles, defenders tried to maintain what cleanliness they could. But without understanding germ theory, Without knowing that contaminated water spread disease, without comprehending that lice and fleas could transmit infection, their efforts were often ineffective. The psychological impact of disease during a siege compounded the physical effects. Watching your comrades waste away, knowing you might be next, created a pervasive atmosphere of dread. Disease didn't discriminate. It killed lords and common soldiers, young and old, strong and weak. Your prowess with a sword meant nothing when dysentery struck. Your noble birth provided no protection from typhus. There was also the knowledge that disease might make your death slower and more agonizing than a clean kill in battle. Being struck by an arrow or sword might kill you, but it would likely be relatively quick. Dying from dysentery meant days or weeks of agony, your body consuming itself, dehydration and fever pushing you toward delirium and death. The accounts of disease during sieges are uniformly grim. Chroniclers, writing sometimes decades later, still expressed horror at what they witnessed. They described bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. They wrote of the stench becoming so overwhelming that people could barely breathe. They recorded instances where disease became so widespread that neither side could effectively fight anymore, both too weakened to attack or defend properly. In some sieges, disease effectively decided the outcome. A garrison might surrender not because they were out of food, or because their walls had been breached, but because so many of them were too sick to fight. An attacking army might withdraw not because they were defeated in battle, but because disease had made continuing the siege impossible. Disease respected neither courage nor strategy. It was the great equalizer, reducing medieval siege warfare to its most fundamental and terrible reality. Human beings, trapped in conditions that slowly destroyed them, unable to escape or to fight back effectively against an enemy they couldn't see, understand, or combat. It was in many ways the purest horror of the medieval siege, the knowledge that no matter how brave you were, how well supplied, how strong your walls or sharp your swords, there was an enemy present that might kill you anyway, slowly and agonizingly, and there was almost nothing you could do to stop it. When conventional siege tactics seemed insufficient, or when commanders wanted to break the enemy's will more completely, medieval warfare descended into calculated terror. Psychological warfare during sieges took many forms, from the public display of atrocities to acts so extreme. They challenge our understanding of what humans are capable of doing to each other. The goal was simple: make the enemy so terrified, so demoralized, that they would surrender rather than continue to resist. One of the most common forms of psychological warfare was the public, execution, or mutilation of prisoners where defenders could see it. A commander might capture some of the garrison during a sortie, or might have prisoners from an earlier engagement. These unfortunate individuals would be brought within sight of the castle walls and killed in ways designed to maximize the psychological impact on those watching. Hanging was common, as were beheadings. But some commanders went further. Prisoners might be maimed, blinded, have hands cut off, or suffer other mutilations before being released to make their way back to the castle, living testimony to what awaited the defenders if they didn't surrender. The display of captured or killed defenders served multiple purposes. It demoralized the garrison, obviously, but it also sent a message about what would happen if the siege ended in an assault rather than a negotiated surrender. Medieval siege warfare had informal rules. A garrison that surrendered before an assault was usually granted terms. They might be allowed to leave with their weapons and property, or at worst would be held for ransom. But a garrison that forced the attackers to take the castle by storm had no such guarantees. They could be killed, enslaved, or subjected to whatever punishment the victorious commander deemed appropriate. The threat of a sack if the castle fell by force was itself a psychological weapon. Defenders would know that every day they held out increased the attackers' investment in the siege, making them more likely to be vindictive when they finally got inside. But surrendering too quickly might be seen as cowardice by their own side. Garrison commanders had to balance these competing pressures constantly. Terror tactics also included hurling unpleasant projectiles over the walls. We've mentioned dead animals and corpses being launched by trebuchets, ostensibly to spread disease but also clearly intended to horrify and demoralise defenders. Severed heads of killed defenders might be catapulted back into the castle. Human waste collected from the siege camp's latrines could be launched in containers designed to break on impact and splatter their contents across defenders and the castle's interior. The message was clear: we will degrade and humiliate you. We will make your environment as horrific as possible until you break. The burning of the surrounding countryside served psychological purposes beyond denying resources. Defenders watching from the walls would see their lords' lands destroyed, villages burned, crops put to the torch. For knights and nobles whose identity and honour were tied to protecting their lands and people, this destruction was personally devastating. They were failing in their fundamental duty, and the smoke rising from burning villages provided a constant visible reminder of that failure. Some commanders employed specific tactics designed to undermine morale. They might send messengers under flags of truce to spread false information, claiming that no relief force was coming, that the defenders had been abandoned by their allies, that surrender terms would only get worse as the siege continued. Sometimes these messages were true, sometimes they were lies. The uncertainty was itself a weapon. Bribes and promises could be used to encourage betrayal. A disgruntled soldier might be convinced to open a gate or sabotage defences in exchange for gold and promises of safety. More than one siege ended through treachery rather than force of arms. The possibility of betrayal from within created paranoia in the garrison. Could you trust your fellow defenders? Might the man standing next to you on watch be negotiating with the enemy? This erosion of trust was itself a form of psychological warfare. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of psychological warfare during medieval sieges was cannibalism. The siege of Ma'ara in 1098, during the First Crusade, provides the most thoroughly documented example. The Crusader army, having recently taken Antioch and now marching toward Jerusalem, laid siege to the Syrian city in late November. The siege was relatively short. The Crusaders breached the walls in mid-December, but what followed has haunted historical accounts ever since. Multiple contemporary sources, more than a dozen Christian chronicles written within 20 years of the event, describe Crusaders consuming the flesh of dead Muslims. The basic fact of the cannibalism isn't seriously disputed by historians. The question is why it happened and under what circumstances. Some accounts, like the Gesta Francorum, describe it as something done secretly due to starvation. Some cut the flesh of dead bodies into strips and cooked them for eating. These accounts emphasise that the Crusaders were suffering from extreme hunger after the siege, and were driven to this extreme by necessity. Other sources, however, tell a different story. Ralph of Caen wrote that adults were put in stew pots, and children were skewered on spits and roasted. His account, along with several others, suggests this was done openly, even theatrically, as a form of psychological warfare. The Chanson d'Antioche and accounts by Guibert of Nogent and William of Tyre all interpret the cannibalism as deliberate attempts to terrorise Muslim defenders in other cities the Crusaders would encounter. The historical consensus today is that both elements were probably involved. Yes, the Crusaders were hungry, supplies were limited, and the campaign had been brutal. But the specific choice to consume only Muslim bodies, and accounts suggesting it was done publicly rather than in secret, indicate that psychological warfare played a significant role. Some Crusaders may have recognised the terror value of such acts and deliberately made a spectacle of them. What's particularly chilling about this incident is that it apparently worked. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir wrote that rumours of the Crusaders' cannibalism spread through the region, and many Muslim commanders subsequently chose to surrender or negotiate rather than fight these bloodthirsty barbarians. The historian Thomas Asbridge notes that while the cannibalism at Ma'ara was among the most infamous atrocities of the First Crusade, it had some positive effects on the Crusaders' short-term prospects. because it convinced many Muslims that these invaders were so savage they couldn't be resisted. This raises deeply troubling questions about the relationship between effectiveness and morality in warfare. The Crusaders at Ma'ara committed acts that shocked even their own chroniclers, acts that required elaborate explanations and justifications in the written records. But those acts may have made their subsequent campaign easier by terrifying potential opponents into submission. Does that make it any less horrific? Of course not. But it does illustrate the lengths to which medieval commanders would go in pursuit of psychological advantage. It's worth noting that cannibalism during sieges wasn't limited to this one incident. During the Great Famine of 1315-1317, there were multiple reports of cannibalism among starving populations. In extreme siege situations where starvation reached its final stages, cannibalism became a possibility that couldn't be entirely ruled out. The taboo against eating human flesh was strong, but hunger can override even the strongest cultural prohibitions. What made cannibalism particularly effective as psychological warfare was its violation of one of humanity's most fundamental taboos. Killing your enemies was normal warfare. Eating them suggested something beyond normal human behaviour, something monstrous that couldn't be reasoned with or resisted through conventional means. It was warfare that attacked not just the body, but the very concept of human dignity and the boundaries between civilization and savagery. Other forms of psychological manipulation were subtler, but no less effective. Medieval commanders understood that hope was essential to a garrison's continued resistance. Anything that undermined that hope was valuable. If you could convince the defenders that no relief was coming, that they'd been abandoned, that their cause was lost, surrender might follow, even when they still had supplies and strength to continue. False messages, forged letters, deliberately allowing some information to leak while concealing other facts. All these tactics were employed to shape the defenders' understanding of their situation. The sight and sound of the siege itself served psychological purposes. The constant bombardment by trebuchets, even if it did limited physical damage, reminded defenders day and night that they were under attack. The crash of stones against walls, the screams of wounded, the shouts of the attackers, this created an atmosphere of constant tension that wore down the garrison's morale over time. The display of siege equipment could itself be psychological warfare. When Edward the Wee built his massive trebuchet Warwolf during the siege of Stirling Castle, the Scots apparently tried to surrender when they saw it, recognising that such a weapon could breach their defences. Edward refused to accept their surrender until he'd had a chance to use his expensive new toy. But the psychological impact was clear. The sight of this massive machine was enough to break the defender's will before a single shot was fired. We should also acknowledge that psychological warfare wasn't solely the domain of the attackers. Defenders engaged in their own forms of psychological resistance. A garrison that appeared well-fed and confident, that made sorties against the besiegers, that maintained discipline and defiance, could demoralise the attacking army. If the attackers had expected a quick victory and instead faced determined resistance, their own morale might crack first. The siege of Kenilworth, as mentioned earlier, demonstrated this. The defenders held out not through superior military tactics, but through sheer determination and the psychological impact of their resistance on the exhausted royal forces. The medieval siege, then, was as much a battle of minds as a battle of arms. Commanders sought to break their enemy's will as much as their walls. Terror, manipulation, atrocity and theatrics all played roles in this psychological warfare. The goal was to make surrender seem not just inevitable but desirable, the only way to escape the horror that continued resistance would bring. This aspect of siege warfare is perhaps the most difficult for us to confront because it reveals the calculated nature of the cruelty involved. These weren't acts of passion or battle fury. They were deliberate choices made by commanders who understood human psychology well enough to know what would terrorise and demoralise their opponents. The medieval siege, stripped of romantic gloss, was warfare that targeted not just the body but the spirit, seeking to destroy the will to resist through whatever means proved effective. And as the evidence from Ma'ara and countless other sieges demonstrates, sometimes the means employed transcended the bounds of what we consider acceptable human behaviour, even in war. While we focus on tactics and technology, the human cost of medieval siege warfare extended far beyond the combatants. The civilians caught in and around besieged locations experienced horrors that military accounts often gloss over or omit entirely. Women, children, the elderly, the sick. These were the people who couldn't fight back, who had no escape, and who suffered consequences of warfare they had no part in creating. When a siege threatened, the surrounding population faced an impossible choice. Flee into the unknown, abandoning everything you own and gambling that you'd find safety elsewhere, or seek refuge in the castle or city walls, trusting that the fortifications would protect you. Many chose the latter, believing that thick stone walls offered more security than the open road. This decision often proved tragically wrong. Inside a besieged castle or city, non-combatants faced all the same horrors as the garrison: dwindling food supplies, disease, the psychological strain of confinement, and the constant danger of projectiles striking anywhere at any time. But they faced additional vulnerabilities. They had no military training, no weapons, no status that might protect them. They were, in the coldest calculus of siege warfare, mouths to feed who contributed nothing to the defence. As we discussed earlier, garrison commanders sometimes made the brutal decision to expel non-combatants to preserve supplies for fighting men. For the civilians expelled, this was a death sentence of the slowest kind. Turned out of the castle, they would approach the besiegers' lines hoping to be allowed through. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. The scene must have been heartbreaking. Families carrying whatever possessions they could manage, children crying, the elderly struggling to walk, all begging to be allowed to pass through the siege lines to safety. The besieging commander had to make his own cold calculation. Letting them through was merciful but allowed the castle to extend its supplies. Refusing passage and forcing them back toward the castle might make the defenders use more supplies caring for them, or, if the commander was truly ruthless, force the defenders to watch these people starve in no man's land, breaking their morale. During the siege of Château Gaillard, as we mentioned, King Philip II employed both tactics. Initially allowing refugees through, he later stopped permitting passage, leaving hundreds trapped between the lines. They remained there for months, visible from both the castle walls and the French camp, slowly dying from exposure and starvation while the siege continued around them. Eventually Philip relented and fed them, but only after using their suffering as a weapon against the defenders' morale. Think about what this meant for these people. You'd made the decision to trust the castle for protection. Then you were expelled because you were no longer useful. You approached the enemy begging for mercy, and they refused. You're trapped in a narrow strip of land, unable to go forward or back with nowhere to shelter from weather or violence. You watch your children grow thinner, weaker, as your supplies run out. You're close enough to see both armies, close enough that they can see you, and neither will help. For women caught in sieges, the dangers went beyond starvation and disease. When a castle or city fell by assault, if the defenders had refused terms and forced an attack, the victorious soldiers often regarded everything inside as theirs to plunder. This included women. Contemporary chronicles are often vague about what they delicately termed the usual misfortunes that befall women in war, but we understand what they meant. Rape was so common in the aftermath of successful assaults that it was barely remarked upon. Women of high status might be protected by their value for ransom, but common women had no such security. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 provides a particularly grim example. After the Crusaders breached the walls, they engaged in a massacre that shocked even some of the participants. Contemporary accounts describe streets literally running with blood, bodies piled in the streets and houses, and mass slaughter of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. In the aftermath, women who survived the initial violence faced the horrors of being captives of an army that had just spent weeks in siege conditions and was now unleashed on the city. One Muslim chronicler's account of the aftermath is explicit about the fate of female captives, women made into concubines, virgins dishonoured, proud women deflowered. The account is graphic and disturbing, but it reflects a reality of medieval siege warfare that we must acknowledge if we're to understand the full human cost. Children suffered perhaps most of all because they couldn't understand why these horrors were happening to them. Imagine being a child in a besieged castle. The constant noise of bombardment, the fear on adults' faces, the gradual deterioration of conditions, the hunger that becomes an overwhelming constant. Children couldn't rationalise that this was temporary, that they might survive if they just endured. They only knew present suffering. Infant mortality in medieval times was already high, but siege conditions made it far worse. Pregnant women giving birth in besieged castles faced terrible odds. Malnutrition, stress, unsanitary conditions and lack of proper medical care meant many died in childbirth or shortly after. Newborns faced even worse chances. Without adequate nutrition for nursing mothers, infants starved. Disease spread more easily among the weakest members of the population. Some infants simply failed to thrive in siege conditions, wasting away despite their parents' desperate efforts. The elderly suffered similarly. Already vulnerable to illness and less able to withstand the physical hardships of siege, they often died early in a prolonged siege. Their deaths at least freed up some provisions for others, a calculation that the garrison had to make even if they couldn't say it aloud. The social fabric that normally provided some protection for vulnerable populations broke down under siege conditions. When everyone was starving, when disease was rampant, when death was an everyday occurrence, the customs of respect and care for the elderly, the sick, the very young, often gave way to simple survival calculation. The psychological trauma of medieval sieges, particularly for non-combatants, is something historians are only beginning to fully explore. We have the diagnostic tools now, PTSD, complex trauma, moral injury, but applying them to historical populations is challenging. What we can say is that people who survived medieval sieges carried those experiences with them for life. How could they not? If you'd watched your children starve, if you'd seen your neighbours killed by falling stones, if you'd lived for months in conditions of unimaginable squalor and terror, you would be permanently changed by that experience. Chronicles occasionally give us glimpses of this trauma. Survivors of particularly brutal sieges sometimes entered monasteries, renouncing the world in favour of lives of prayer and contemplation. This was understood as religious devotion, but we might also see it as a response to trauma, seeking peace and order after experiencing chaos and horror. Others apparently never recovered mentally, their minds broken by what they'd endured. Medieval people didn't have our vocabulary for mental illness, but they recognised when someone had been fundamentally damaged by their experiences. The impact on families was catastrophic. Sieges separated families, killed family members, destroyed homes and livelihoods. A family that entered a siege together might emerge scattered, with some dead, others permanently separated, all traumatised and impoverished. The castle or city they'd trusted to protect them might lie in ruins. The lands they'd worked might be burned and barren. Everything they'd known was destroyed, and they had to somehow build new lives from the wreckage. For soldiers and the garrison, the psychological impact was different but no less severe. Men who'd killed in battle were common enough in medieval society, but siege warfare was different from a pitched battle. The prolonged nature of it, the daily exposure to death and suffering, the moral compromises it demanded, these took a toll that went beyond the brief violence of battle. Soldiers who'd participated in massacres after successful assaults, who'd watched civilians starve in no man's land, who'd thrown diseased corpses over walls or participated in other atrocities, had to live with those actions afterward. Some medieval sources suggest that knights and soldiers who'd done such things sought absolution through pilgrimage or extra acts of piety. The Crusades themselves can be partly understood as opportunities for violent men to earn spiritual redemption through service to the Church. But these were imperfect solutions to the problem of living with what one had done or seen. The social cost of sieges extended beyond individual trauma. Communities were destroyed. Towns that had grown up around castles might be burned or abandoned. The economic impact of a prolonged siege could devastate a region for years. Fields left unplanted or burned, livestock killed or driven off, trade disrupted, population scattered. Recovery from these effects took generations. Medieval society was already precarious, with most people living close to subsistence level. A siege could push entire regions over the edge into poverty and famine. There's also something to be said about the impact on those who witnessed sieges from a distance. When refugees fled besieged areas and spread out into the surrounding regions, they brought their stories with them. These accounts would spread, becoming part of the collective memory and consciousness of medieval people. Everyone knew someone who'd been in a siege or knew someone who knew someone. The terror of the siege became part of the mental landscape, a constant background fear that warfare could trap you in a months-long nightmare that you might not survive. This fear influenced everything from settlement patterns to political alliances. Lords knew their people would be less willing to support causes that might lead to their homes being besieged. Common people would flee at the first sign that a siege might be coming, making it harder to maintain economic activity in contested regions. The mere threat of a siege could accomplish some of what an actual siege would, destabilizing an area and making it harder to govern. We should also acknowledge the impact on those who never experienced siege warfare directly, but who paid for it in other ways. The taxes levied to support siege operations were crushing. Providing supplies for thousands of troops for months on end, building and maintaining siege equipment, paying engineers and specialized troops, all this required enormous amounts of money that had to come from somewhere. For the peasants and townspeople who paid these taxes, siege warfare meant impoverishment even if they never came near a besieged castle. The human cost of medieval siege warfare, then, extended in ripples far beyond the immediate combatants and the castle walls. It encompassed the civilians trapped in the siege, the families torn apart, the communities destroyed, the survivors traumatized, and the broader population that paid for these conflicts in blood and treasure. When we talk about the horrors of medieval sieges, we need to remember all these victims, not just the knights and soldiers whose stories made it into the chronicles, the women and children whose names were never recorded, the elderly who died in obscurity, the refugees who perished between the lines, the survivors who carried their scars forever. These were the true casualties of medieval siege warfare, and their suffering represents perhaps the greatest moral indictment of this form of conflict. To understand the full horror of medieval siege warfare, we need to examine specific historical examples in detail. While we've referenced several sieges throughout this narrative, looking closely at particular events reveals patterns and details that illuminate the broader reality of what these sieges meant for those who experienced them. The siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 stands as a textbook example of medieval siegecraft at its most technically sophisticated. When King John arrived at Rochester in October 1215, he faced one of England's most formidable fortifications, a massive stone keep with walls 12 feet thick, at the base. The rebels inside, supporters of the barons who opposed John, knew they held a strategically vital position. Rochester controlled the road from Dover to London, and whoever held it controlled traffic between the capital and the continent. John brought everything he could to bear. 5 siege engines were set up and bombarded the castle day and night. Contemporary accounts mention that the noise was constant. The crash of stone against stone, punctuated by the creaking of the trebuchets and the shouts of the operators. The outer walls eventually breached, but the defenders retreated to the massive keep and continued their resistance. The keep withstood the bombardment, its thick walls absorbing blow after blow without significant damage. John then turned to mining. As we've detailed, his miners dug a tunnel under the southeast corner tower, shoring it up with timber. the famous order for 40 fat pigs, whose rendered fat would fuel the fire that brought down the tower, demonstrates the level of planning and resources that went into such operations. When the mine collapsed and the tower fell, it must have been a moment of terror for the defenders. Suddenly a whole section of their fortress, which had seemed impregnable, was simply gone. The noise, the dust, the shock of seeing stone walls crumble, it's hard to imagine what that did to their morale. But still they fought on, retreating behind the keep's internal wall. Only when all their provisions were exhausted, when they'd been reduced to eating their horses and had nothing left, did they finally surrender after almost 8 weeks. The siege of Château Gaillard from September 1203 to March 1204 demonstrates both the sophistication of castle design and the determination of besiegers who wouldn't accept any defence as impregnable. Richard the Lionheart had built this castle to be the perfect fortress, incorporating every defensive innovation he'd learned in the Crusades. It featured multiple baileys separated by moats, concentric defences, machicolations, and advanced design that should have made it nearly impossible to take. King Philip II of France approached the siege methodically. He first isolated the castle by taking nearby fortifications, then invested Château Gaillard completely. An English relief attempt failed spectacularly when coordination between land and water forces broke down. The relief fleet arrived too late to prevent the French from repelling the land attack, then was itself driven off when the French were ready for them. For the defenders under Roger de Lacy, this must have been a crushing blow. They'd held out expecting relief, and that relief had not just failed, but been decisively defeated. Hope, which had sustained them through months of siege, evaporated. Philip's forces demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in the actual assault. First they took an island in the river using Greek fire, then they turned their attention to the castle itself. Traditional mining brought down part of the outer bailey wall. But the real breakthrough came through an unexpected route. A French soldier discovered that the chapel's latrine chute was large enough for a man to climb through. A small force infiltrated the castle this way, opened gates from inside, and the outer bailey fell. The defenders retreated to the middle bailey, but the French were relentless. They eventually breached the inner bailey as well, and the garrison retreated to the keep as a final refuge. With supplies nearly exhausted after 6 months, with much of the supposedly impregnable castle in enemy hands, Roger de Lacy finally surrendered in March 1204. The psychological impact of Château Gaillard's fall was enormous. Richard had boasted that he could hold this castle even if its walls were made of butter. It had cost a fortune to build, more than an entire year's revenue for the English crown, and yet it fell in less than a year to a determined siege. The myth of the impregnable castle died with Château Gaillard. The sieges during the Crusades provide some of the most detailed accounts of siege warfare's human cost, in part because they involved extensive chronicling from both Christian and Muslim sources. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 ended with what one chronicler called a slaughter so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. The Crusaders had besieged the city for over a month in the brutal heat of summer. Water was scarce, supplies were limited, and the longer the siege continued, the more desperate the Crusaders became. They knew that a Muslim relief army might arrive at any time, which put them under enormous time pressure. When the Crusaders finally breached the walls using siege towers, the pent-up frustration, fear, and religious fervour of the previous weeks exploded into violence that shocked even some participants. Muslims and Jews were killed indiscriminately. The massacre continued for days. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood, the temple area knee-deep in gore, bodies burned in vast pyres because there were too many to bury. It was a horror that coloured the Crusaders' reputation for generations. The contrast with the siege of Jerusalem in 1187 under Saladin is instructive. When Saladin's forces invested the city, the defenders knew they couldn't hold out long. The massacre of 1099 haunted everyone's memory. What would Muslim forces do to the Christians who'd perpetrated that atrocity? but Saladin deliberately chose a different path. He offered terms. The city surrendered with an agreement that allowed most Christians to ransom themselves and leave. While many who couldn't afford the ransom were enslaved, and the fate of female captives was grim, the bloodbath of 1099 wasn't repeated. Saladin apparently understood that mercy could be more effective than massacre, and his reputation benefited enormously from the contrast with the Crusaders' earlier behaviour. The Siege of Acre from 1189 to 1191 during the Third Crusade was notable for its length and the disease that ravaged both sides. The Crusaders arrived in August 1189 and began investing the city, but Muslim forces under Saladin then surrounded the Crusaders, creating a bizarre situation where the Crusaders were simultaneously besieging Acre and being besieged themselves by Saladin's army. This lasted almost 2 years. The Crusader camp became a nightmare of disease. Dysentery, typhus, scurvy, all swept through the crowded, unsanitary siege camp. Thousands died. Even prominent leaders weren't spared. The smell from the camp, with its countless shallow graves and poor sanitation, reportedly could be detected from great distances. Morale collapsed repeatedly, and only the arrival of major leaders like Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus of France kept the siege going. Inside Acre, conditions were arguably worse. Cut off from outside supplies, with a large civilian population in addition to the garrison, food became scarce and then non-existent. Disease struck there as well. The city held out as long as it could, but when Saladin's relief attempts all failed, and it became clear no help was coming, Acre surrendered in July 1191. The terms included the release of Christian prisoners and payment of a ransom. When Saladin couldn't meet the payment schedule, Richard had thousands of Muslim prisoners executed in view of Saladin's army. This act of brutality, however rationalised by Richard's need to continue his campaign and his unwillingness to leave a large number of prisoners behind, demonstrated once again that siege warfare could drive even supposedly chivalrous knights to commit atrocities. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453 marked both the end of the Byzantine Empire and, symbolically, the end of the Middle Ages. The Theodosian walls had stood for over 1,000 years, protecting the city through countless sieges. When Sultan Mehmed II arrived with his massive Ottoman army in April 1453, he brought with him the newest technology, enormous cannons that could fire stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. For nearly 2 months these cannons pounded the ancient walls. The noise must have been apocalyptic. The boom of the cannons, the crash of massive stone balls striking walls, the rumble of masonry collapsing. The defenders, vastly outnumbered, worked desperately to repair breaches each night, but the relentless bombardment gradually wore down both the walls and the people defending them. Emperor Constantine the Stinthythans knew the cause was hopeless, but chose to fight on anyway. The final assault came on May 29th. Ottoman forces poured through breaches in the wall and overwhelmed the exhausted defenders. Constantine died fighting in the streets, his body never conclusively identified. The subsequent sack of the city was brutal, though Mehmed eventually ordered it stopped. Libraries were destroyed, churches desecrated, thousands enslaved. The last remnant of the Roman Empire, which had survived in the East for a millennium after Rome itself fell, was finally extinguished. These sieges, separated by centuries and thousands of miles, share common threads. They demonstrate the sophisticated tactics and technology employed. They reveal the human cost in death, suffering and trauma. They show how sieges could end in negotiated surrender or bloody massacre. And they illustrate that siege warfare was the dominant form of medieval conflict, shaping the period's political, military and social history in ways that pitched battles never could. Each siege was unique in its details, but all shared the fundamental characteristics we've explored. The grinding attrition, the battle between starvation and supplies, the disease, the psychological warfare, the terror. These weren't aberrations. This was normal medieval warfare, repeated hundreds of times across the period, each siege adding its own contribution to the collective experience of horror that defined this mode of conflict. When a siege finally ended, whether through surrender or successful assault, the aftermath brought its own horrors and revealed the full cost of what had transpired. Victory in a siege was rarely the glorious triumph that medieval epics might suggest. It was exhausted, often Pyrrhic, and the consequences rippled far beyond the immediate participants. The rules of medieval warfare made a sharp distinction between how a siege could end. If a garrison surrendered before an assault was launched, they could negotiate terms. These might allow them to march out with their weapons, their honour intact, often even retaining their property. They might be held for ransom, which was unpleasant but honourable, and survivable for nobles and knights. Common soldiers might be less fortunate, but would generally be released eventually. But if a garrison forced the attackers to take the castle or city by storm, all bets were off. The attackers had invested enormous resources in the siege: time, money, supplies, and most importantly, lives. The blood price paid in successful assaults was often terrible. Soldiers scaling ladders or storming through breaches faced appalling casualties. When they finally broke through, their rage and frustration had built to levels that commanders often couldn't or wouldn't try to control. The result was typically a sack. Everything inside the castle or city became the property of the victorious army. This meant not just goods and valuables, but people. Massacre was common. Rape was routine. Enslavement was standard practice. Any wealth that could be carried off would be looted. Buildings might be deliberately destroyed. The violence could continue for days until either the army's bloodlust was satisfied or commanders managed to restore discipline. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 exemplified this pattern at its most extreme. The Crusaders had been frustrated by the siege, suffering in the summer heat, fearful of a relief army, religiously motivated to reclaim the holy city. When they finally broke through, the slaughter was spectacular and appalling. Contemporary accounts, even from the Crusaders themselves, describe scenes of unimaginable carnage. The Temple Mount was said to be ankle-deep in blood. Bodies filled the streets. The city's Muslim and Jewish populations were hunted through the streets and killed. Not all died. Some were held for ransom or enslaved, but the death toll was immense. Even decades later, chroniclers struggled to describe what had happened, often falling back on biblical imagery because normal language seemed inadequate. For the commanders and lords who ordered or prosecuted sieges, the financial cost was often ruinous. Maintaining an army in the field for months cost enormous amounts of money. Paying soldiers, feeding them, building and maintaining siege equipment, hiring specialised engineers and craftsmen, all of this drained treasuries at devastating rates. King Henry III's siege of Kenilworth Castle reportedly cost so much that he had to pawn jewels from Westminster Abbey to pay for it. And that was a siege on his home territory. Foreign campaigns were even more expensive. Many nobles and even kings bankrupted themselves prosecuting sieges. The promised loot from successful assaults often didn't materialise, either because the besieged location wasn't as wealthy as hoped, or because the destruction during the assault and subsequent sack damaged or destroyed much of the valuable goods. This created pressure to allow sacking as a way to repay soldiers who hadn't been paid properly throughout the siege. The political consequences of sieges could be equally significant. A successful defence could make or break reputations and dynasties. The defence of Constantinople multiple times preserved the Byzantine Empire for centuries beyond when it might otherwise have fallen. The fall of major fortifications could destabilise entire regions, triggering cascades of further military action as local powers rushed to fill the vacuum. The propaganda value of sieges was enormous. A lord who successfully defended his castle against overwhelming odds became a hero. A king who took a supposedly impregnable fortress demonstrated his power and capabilities. Chronicles and songs would celebrate or condemn based on siege outcomes in ways that shaped political realities for generations. But we should also consider the aftermath for the survivors, both victors and defeated. For For the victorious soldiers, having spent months in siege conditions, having participated in the violence of an assault and the atrocities of a sack, there was the question of what this did to them as human beings. Medieval people understood, in their own terms, that such experiences changed men. Religious institutions offered rituals of purification and absolution, recognizing that soldiers needed spiritual cleansing after what they'd done. For the defeated garrison, surrender meant different things depending on status and circumstances. Nobles and knights, as mentioned, might be held for ransom, an honourable captivity that could last months or years, but usually ended with their release when the ransom was paid. Common soldiers were less fortunate. They might be released, enslaved, or executed depending on the victor's whim and calculation. Civilians caught in a besieged city faced the worst outcomes. If they survived the assault and immediate violence, they still had to survive the sack. Women faced sexual violence as a near certainty. Anyone of value might be held for ransom. Others would be enslaved. The old, the sick, children too young to be useful, their fate varied. But often they were simply left to fend for themselves in a destroyed city or countryside. The physical aftermath of a siege left lasting marks on the landscape. Castle walls might be demolished or slighted, partially destroyed so they couldn't be easily used again by rebels. This was common after sieges during civil wars where the victorious side wanted to prevent future uprisings but couldn't garrison every castle they'd taken. Towns and cities that had been sacked might take decades to recover, if they recovered at all. The population scattered, trade disrupted, buildings destroyed. All of this had to be rebuilt, and often the resources or will to do so simply weren't available. Some places never recovered to their former importance. The countryside around a siege site would be devastated. Armies living off the land would strip it bare. Deliberate destruction of crops and livestock to deny them to the enemy left the peasant population facing starvation. The burning of fields and villages created wastelands that took years to recover. Refugees from besieged areas would flood into surrounding regions, straining those areas' resources and potentially spreading disease. There's also the question of what happened to all the bodies. Medieval sieges killed thousands, between combat casualties, disease deaths, and massacre. These bodies had to be dealt with, and medieval societies didn't always have good solutions. Mass graves were common. Bodies might be burned in pyres. In some cases, they were simply left where they fell, creating public health hazards that took months to address. The psychological aftermath we've already discussed, but it's worth emphasising again. The survivors of medieval sieges carried trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Communities that had experienced sieges passed down those memories for generations. The stories became warnings and lessons, shaping how future generations understood warfare and risk. The economic consequences extended far beyond the immediate costs. Regions affected by sieges might see their tax base destroyed, trade routes disrupted, and productive capacity demolished. This could trigger spiral effects, poverty leading to inability to defend against future threats, leading to more destruction. Some regions never recovered their former prosperity, their decline dating directly to a particularly devastating siege. For historians studying these events centuries later, the full cost is difficult to calculate. We have records of some expenses, some casualty figures, some descriptions of destruction. But the human cost, the trauma, the suffering, the families destroyed, the lives derailed, this doesn't fit neatly into account books or chronicles. We catch glimpses in the sources, a chronicle mentioning survivors entering monasteries, a legal dispute over who owned lands after the original owners died in a siege, a passing reference to a town never recovering. These are fragments that hint at stories we can never fully know. What we can say with certainty is that medieval siege warfare represented one of the darkest aspects of the period. It combined military innovation with systematic cruelty. It tested human endurance to its limits, and often beyond. It created suffering on a scale that affected not just the immediate participants, but entire regions and populations. The cost in human terms was incalculable, but it was paid nonetheless by thousands upon thousands of people who had the misfortune to be caught in or around a siege. The medieval siege, then, was not just a military tactic or a historical curiosity. It was a catastrophe that repeated itself across centuries, each iteration adding to a collective experience of trauma that shaped medieval society in profound ways. Understanding this is essential to understanding the medieval period itself, to grasping why people made the choices they did, why they built the structures they built, why they reacted to threats the way they reacted. The siege was the nightmare that haunted the medieval imagination, and with good reason. It was a nightmare that many people lived through, and whose echoes we can still trace in the historical record if we know where to look. The medieval siege was warfare at its most methodical, most patient, and most pitiless. As we have explored in detail throughout this narrative, sieges weren't brief affairs of heroic assault and glorious victory. They were grinding campaigns of attrition that could last months or years, that killed more through starvation and disease than combat, that broke the will as systematically as they breached walls. From the 11th through the 15th centuries, as castles proliferated across Europe and the Middle East, the siege became the dominant form of military conflict. Pitched battles were relatively rare, spectacular when they occurred but not the normal mode of warfare. Instead, armies marched from fortification to fortification, investing castles and cities, settling in for the slow work of reducing each one through whatever combination of assault, mining, starvation, disease, and psychological pressure proved effective. The technology and tactics we've examined, trebuchets, mining, starvation blockades, these were refined over centuries into sophisticated methods that required substantial resources and expertise to employ. But for all their sophistication, they were ultimately just tools for inflicting suffering on a scale and duration that would break the enemy's will to resist. The human cost was staggering. We've seen it in the disease-ridden camps at Acre, in the starving refugees trapped between the lines at Château Gaillard, in the cannibalism at Acre, in the massacres at Jerusalem. These weren't exceptional events. They were the normal pattern of medieval siege warfare, repeated in siege after siege across the period. Thousands died in each of these events, and hundreds of sieges occurred. The total cost in human lives and human suffering is beyond our ability to fully calculate. What makes the medieval siege particularly haunting is its deliberate nature. This wasn't violence in the heat of battle, where adrenaline and fear might excuse some degree of brutality. This was calculated patient cruelty. Commanders made decisions about whether to allow refugees through their lines, knowing full well that refusing meant those people would die slowly in no man's land. They chose to launch diseased corpses over walls. They employed terror tactics designed to break the enemy psychologically. These were conscious choices made by people who understood exactly what they were doing and what consequences would follow. The siege represented a kind of warfare where the normal restraints on violence broke down. The longer a siege lasted, the more dehumanized both sides became. Defenders weren't people, but obstacles to be removed. Attackers weren't an army, but a slow-moving catastrophe that consumed everything in its path. By the time a siege ended, whether through negotiated surrender or violent assault, both sides had been transformed by the experience in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. Understanding medieval sieges is important, because it reveals the reality of medieval warfare, stripped of romantic gloss. There were no gallant knights and fair maidens in the typical siege. There were desperate people trapped in increasingly horrific conditions, trying to survive while inflicting and enduring suffering that would traumatize them permanently. The legacy of this form of warfare extended well beyond the medieval period. The techniques developed during medieval sieges influenced military thinking for centuries. The psychological understanding of how to break an enemy's will informed later conflicts. The recognition that civilian populations could be weapons or targets shaped the way warfare was prosecuted. Some aspects of medieval siege warfare would seem familiar to observers of modern conflicts. The use of starvation as a weapon, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the employment of terror tactics, the creation of humanitarian crises. The specific technologies have changed, but the underlying logic of siege warfare, isolate, exhaust, and ultimately break the enemy through whatever means prove effective, remains recognizable. This is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the medieval siege, the demonstration that humans are capable of systematizing cruelty, of turning suffering into strategy, of maintaining this pressure not for hours or days but for months on end. The medieval siege revealed capacities for both endurance and cruelty that should give us pause even now, centuries removed from these events. So what should we take away from this exploration of medieval siege warfare? First, that our understanding of medieval warfare needs to be grounded in this reality. The siege was the dominant form of conflict, and it was nothing like the romantic imagery that popular culture often presents. Second, that the human cost of warfare extends far beyond combatants, and siege warfare demonstrates this with particular clarity. The civilians, the non-combatants, the people trapped by circumstances they didn't create, these suffered consequences as terrible as any soldier, often worse. Third, that the medieval period was marked by conflicts that traumatized entire populations and regions. The siege wasn't an aberration, but a normal part of medieval life, a catastrophe that could strike any community that found itself in a strategic location or on the wrong side of a political dispute. The stories we've explored, Rochester, Kenilworth, Château Gaillard, Jerusalem, Acre, Ma'ara, these are just the ones that happen to be well documented. For every recorded siege, there were others that left fewer traces in the historical record, but were just as terrible for those who experienced them. As we look back across the centuries at these events, we should remember that we're not examining abstract historical phenomena. We're looking at real people who suffered in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend. Each statistic represented a human being, someone's parent or child, someone who had dreams and fears, someone who suffered and died or survived carrying trauma that would mark them forever. The medieval siege haunts us not just because of its scale, but because of what it reveals about human nature. Given the right circumstances, people prove capable of terrible things, not in moments of passion, but through calculated, sustained effort. But the sieges also reveal human capacity for endurance, for maintaining hope and dignity in the face of overwhelming suffering, for surviving and building new lives from the ruins of catastrophe. That capacity for both cruelty and endurance is the legacy of the medieval siege, a legacy that continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental aspects of human nature that remain unchanged across the centuries. This, then, is what actually happened during medieval sieges. Not glory, not heroism, just suffering, endurance, and the slow grinding down of human spirit and flesh until something finally broke. It's a history that should haunt us, because understanding what humans did to each other in these sieges and why helps us understand what we're still capable of, for better and for worse, in our own time.